Hello chess friends and welcome to the channel. My name is Mauri. In today's video we are going to look at a game from the Tilburg 1997 chess tournament played between two of the top players at the time, Vladimir Kramnik from Russia and Alexei Shirov from Latvia. So Kramnik with the white pieces starts by bringing out his knight, and Shirov does the same. And then after the opening moves c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, d4, we have transposed to the king's Indian defense and Shirov castles. Here, common move would be h3, but even more common is the move that Kramnik played, bishop e2, and e5 also the number one move in this position. And I just want to point out that black is not blundering a pawn here, although it might seem like it after the move d takes e5 and takes. Here white could think that he's winning a pawn either by taking immediately or taking the queen on d8 first and then take, but in both cases it doesn't work for white. For example, like this, take, black has the move knight takes e4 with a discovered attack on the knight on e5, so take, and of course something like knight takes f7 doesn't work because of bishop takes c3, and then black is a piece up, so that doesn't work. Also in this position, if you take immediately, it's kind of the same thing, although black just takes, and then he just takes here, wins back the pawn with a good position. So back to the game after e5. You can't win a pawn here as white. What you could do is you could decide either to close the position up with d5, or like Kramnik did, you could just simply castle. And now Shirov played knight c6, politely asking the white pawn on d4 what it intends to do. And bishop e3 is an option. For example, after knight g4 there is bishop g5, f6, bishop c1 and so forth. But Kramnik now decides to close the position with d5, and after knight e7 he plays b4. So white's plan is to push for c5, then maybe take on d6 and create a potential target on d6, also opening up the c file for his rooks and other pieces. And black's plan here is to basically play f5 and then go for an attack on the king side. So those are kind of the typical plans for both sides in this position. Black could also challenge the pawn on b4 with the move a5, since a3 is not possible here. So a continuation here could be b takes a5, rook takes, and then a4. We would have a completely different game to what happened, because Shirov didn't play a5. Instead he played knight h5, so he wants to push for f5. Here Kramnik played rook e1, and indeed f5 does come. And Kramnik played knight g5, eyeing the e6 square for his knight. And then after knight f4, this knight on f4 is quite strong, and so it's a logical move for Kramnik to just take this knight, even though he does lose the bishop pair admittedly, but allowing the knight to stay in f4 didn't appeal to Kramnik, understandably so. And after e takes f4, so rook c1 doesn't just defend the knight, but it also supports a potential c5 push later on. And here after bishop f6, attacking the knight on g5, Kramnik jumps into the square on e6 with a sort of a fork, I guess, but this can be taken, of course, like this, and take. And here, well, you might think, what about this pawn on e6? Can black win it? And he could try, but it's just not going to work with queen c8 after a move like e takes f5, and let's say knight takes. Now there is a clever move here for white, which is the move c5, and if you play queen takes e6, knight d5 is quite strong, so the threat is to take on c7 with a fork against the queen and the rook in the corner. So let's say, for example, play bishop d8 to defend against that. Now white has some crushing moves like knight takes c7, and if you with a fork again, and if you take that, then you lose the queen like this. Also, an even stronger move here is actually bishop c4, and you can see that the queen is attacked by the rook on e1, and actually it doesn't matter where the queen goes, there's going to be a discovered check, and the queen actually cannot survive this. For example, queen d7, knight f6 with a double check and a fork against the king and the queen. Or let's say queen c8, same thing, double check and a fork again, always winning the queen. Queen f7 also doesn't work. After knight takes f4, the queen is just not going to survive. So none of this works for black after the move d takes e6, so queen c8 wasn't even tried in the game. Instead, Shirov saw a way to win a pawn by giving up his bishop for the knight on c3, because now he can take on e4. But after bishop f1, it's kind of hard to see how black defends the pawn on e4. So Shirov played e3, and Kramnik simply took this. And here black basically has two main options. He can recapture on e3, or he can play f3 like this, and then we would have a different game. According to the computers, both moves are okay for black. Shirov did take like this, and now the pawn on e6 is quite well defended and can become dangerous. Shirov played c6, and after queen d2, d5, he took, pawn took, and queen d4, just centralizing the queen quite nicely on d4. Shirov played queen d6, and here queen c5 was played. Sure, you could take this queen like this, take, and rook ac8, and black's actually doing pretty well here, and the game just simply goes on. Shirov didn't want that. Instead he played queen f4 with the threat to play queen f2, king h1, and then queen takes f1, rook takes, and rook takes checkmate. So that is a threat here, but one which can be rather easily parried actually with a move rook f3, which is what Kramnik did. Queen g5 defends the knight on e7, but here this move rook f7 is quite strong actually, and annoying for black. We're threatening the knight, and if you allow this rook to stay there, it's just never going to work out for black. So obviously he's forced to take. As you can see, it's also a pawn sacrifice, but the black king is going to be more vulnerable than the white one from now on. So after queen c7, the knight is pinned, as you can see. Queen h4 was played, threatening the rook on e1. And now this move rook e3 is quite clever, because this rook lift puts the rook on the third rank, where it can swing in all sorts of directions, and rook f3 for example. So black is actually still doing okay, though. It should be pointed out that after the move rook f8, black is actually still fine. Had he played that, he didn't play that, but had he played that, and then after queen e5, for example, there is this line, queen e5, knight c6, and check, king g8. Black gives back this pawn here, but black is actually holding on here. So for example, I'm just giving a sample line. After queen d7, knight e7, there is take, take, take. But after queen d4, king h1, knight d5, black is actually doing fine here, with his pieces active and whatnot. So this would have been fine for black, but instead, unfortunately for Alexei Shirov, he played the move queen takes b4, and this move loses. Kramnik exploits it quite nicely with the move a3, sort of overloading the queen, which is both defending b7 and e7. So queen h4 is kind of forced to keep defending the knight. But then Kramnik starts by taking a pawn, threatening the rook, which has to go away, and then taking another pawn. And although material is technically even here, white is actually winning because, well, the rook, if you compare the rooks, for example, the white rook is just much more active, whereas the black rook is quite passive. The black king is more vulnerable than the white one. And finally, we could mention that the white bishop is stronger in this position with his long range than the knight is. So Shirov played pawn to d4, but now comes the bishop to c4. So you can see that now all of white's pieces, the queen, the rook, and the bishop, they're all quite active, whereas you can't say the same of all of the black pieces. King f8, and now the move g3, threatening the queen. Here, if you play a move like, for example, queen f6, and then what wins is rook e6. And so the point being that if you play a move like queen g5, then after queen takes d4, white didn't just win a pawn, he has some serious threats also, like queen h8 and whatnot. Also in this position, let's say you play queen g7 to keep an eye out for the pawn on d4. Then there is the rather uncomfortable move queen b6, and the threat of rook f6 is not that easy to deal with. So that's why g3 was a clever move after black's last move king f8. And there was this g3 move, and that's why Shirov played queen g4, because it both protects the pawn on d4 and it also prevents rook f3 check, but it's not enough. Kramnik played bishop e2, attacking the queen once again. Queen goes away, and now queen takes d4. As you can see, white is up by one outside passed pawn, and the white pieces are still much more dangerous than the black pieces are. So after queen takes d4, Shirov played queen c1 check, but after king g2 he resigned, and I want to show you possible continuation from this position and why he resigned. White has some threats that are kind of hard to meet. Queen c6 check, bishop f3, another check, rook e2, queen b3, and now this clever move bishop c6. It looks like he's blundering the piece, whereas he's actually not. After takes, then queen h8 just simply wins. If you play queen g8, then white just plays rook takes e8, and afterwards queen takes queen. And if you play here, then this is just obviously hopeless. White is a rook up. Also, if you don't take on c6, let's say you play rook c8, and then that also isn't enough after the move bishop to d7, threatening the rook, but also the next move will be, if the rook moves, then the next move will be queen f6, which is kind of devastating here, because, well, what are you going to do? If you play queen f7, then white can just trade queens and then take the rook, for example. Or if you play king g8, and then there is bishop e6 winning the queen. There's also a little bit of a funny line here. If black, instead of, for example, rook c2, plays rook c7, then white wins with rook f2 check. And here, for example, if you play knight f5, then there is take, take, check, and take with a completely winning position. But also in this position, after the check, instead of knight f5, if you play king g8, then there's a really nice move, bishop e6 check, and obviously you have to take that. So then comes queen d8 check, and then only move king g7 and queen f8 checkmate. So strong performance by Vladimir Kramnik. Shirov, like I said before, also was one of the strongest players in the world at the time, and I myself was actually lucky enough to play Shirov in a simul a few years before this game was played, and I managed to draw Shirov. I was quite happy with that, of course. That was just a little side story, but I hope you enjoyed looking at this game with me today, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.